So imagine you're asking the database management system to give you a specific some information. And so as the database structure becomes more and more complex, it becomes also more and more difficult to get the specific piece of information that we want. And if you have a very complex database layout or schema, let's say, as you see on the right side, then getting a specific piece of information can be a little bit tricky. That's why we write database queries. So you could write a very complex database query in which lots of ways, imagine it looks like a computer program. So if you have used a programming language before, and that query will then instruct the relational database management system to grab a specific piece of information from the database. So here I have, for example, an employee table, and this employee table defines specific information about the employee. So up here in this table, we have the column names such as employee ID, first name, last name, gender, and the salary. Okay, so I am storing 5 pieces of information about each employee. And so, for example, we have the first employee, which is Ben, his first name, his last name is Hawkins, his gender is male, and he has a salary of 70,000. And so all tables in the relational database are going to have two things, okay? So they are going to have the columns. The columns are the ones which we have the first name, last name, gender, salary, employee IDs, and we're going to have the rows. So the columns are the vertical section right here, and you have the horizontal, which are the rows. And the important thing about the column is that the column defines a single attribute, okay? So we have the first name column, and inside the first name column we have the first name of all employees. And then we have the gender column. Inside gender column we have the genders of all employees, which makes sense. And in the rows kind of individual entries of the employee, okay? And individual entry employee, so a row is a horizontal entry, will represent a single employee each time. So single row, which will have the employee ID, first, last name, and the gender and salary. So this, what we understand from here, it's important to keep in mind that always a column represents a single attribute and the row represents an entry of actual employee. Whenever we are creating a table in a relational database, we always want to have one very special column, which is called the primary key. And the primary key basically a kind of an attribute which uniquely defines the row in database. So it's attribute about a specific entry which will uniquely define. So over here that you see on the left side, we have employee ID, which is EMP ID. And notice that I colored this one in yellow, and I also underlined it. So this underline is basically going to specify that this column or this attribute of the employee is going to be the primary key. In other words, we can use this attribute to uniquely identify a specific row. So imagine over here we have the Steve. His gender is male and his ID is a number 3. So we will say that Steve primary key is a 3. Now let me show you guys why primary key very handy. So down here I have highlighted in blue 2 entries in this database. So we have 2 employees, both of which their first name are both Steve, and they are also both have gender male, and they have the same salary of the 45,000 each. So isn't that special case right here? You can imagine that in company you have 2 employees with the same first name who are the same gender and the salary. Imagine that if you don't have the last name, how can we differentiate between this guy and this guy? So we have 2 Steve, employee the numbers 3 and 5, and so of course in that case you can use the primary key. So even so the name and the gender and the salary of this row table are the same as the name of other Steve, the IDs is different. I mean the primary key is different, and that's why the whole point of the primary key is that the primary key is always going to be unique for each row in the table. So even if all the attributes of the row are the same, the primary key will not be, and therefore we can differentiate between the two rows here that we see, and I can differentiate easily between the Steve and other Steve by referring to their employee ID. So generally, whenever we have a table in a relational database, so you have to always want to define a primary key uniquely. I mean, you cannot have the same primary key for the different rows. And primary key can be anything. It can be a number, it could be string or text. And the more important point that it has to be uniquely identifies a specific row. In other words, another row in the employee table could not have the same employee ID or same primary key.